You have the control to not continue talking badly, and you can either choose to forgive them or, choose not to be friends with them. Those are your choices. And I think those everyday little things do prepare us. But if kids never have to overcome any obstacles, they will not be prepared for life.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scholé Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 2 graduates. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Have you joined the Scholé Sistership yet? In January, we kicked off our annual 5x5 reading challenge. It's not too late to join us. All you have to do is head on over to scholésisters.com/join and sign up for the Sophie plan. And in addition to a replay of our big kickoff webinar, you'll get tons of accountability, book ideas, and support. That's scholésisters.com/join. Today we're discussing grit. What is grit, really? And do kids need grit? Do moms need grit? And if we need it, how do we get it? You're going to enjoy thinking through these questions, and so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I finished this in December, but I wanted to bring it up because it was such a great book, and I've kind of reread parts of it. And actually, it goes really well with today's topical discussion. It's a short story, and it's based on a myth of a Alaskan tribe. It is something totally unique. I've not really read a lot of Native American folklore or mythology or anything like that. It's super interesting, well written, and it's called Two Old Women, an Alaska Legend of Betrayal, Courage, and Survival. And it's by Velma Wallace. And she was like the oldest of 11 children. And she was raised in the Yukon, and she lived a very interesting life herself. And then she just started writing these stories, and it's fascinating. The story starts out with this, the people, they call themselves, and they are coming upon a harsh winter, and it has been a really rough couple of years. And so they have a tradition of leaving the elderly behind when it got too rough. And they didn't happen very often, but when it was really, really dire, they talked about these 2 old women. And the reason they left them is because they were whiners and complainers. And they had stopped really contributing to the tribe. And you couldn't speak against the leaders. So even if they didn't want to, they thought that they would be left behind as well. So that's the betrayal part. The grandson leaves her a hatchet, and then these 2 old women just decide they're not going to put up with this. They said, let us die trying. So it's this story of them getting to an old campground and finding things to survive. And there's a couple great quotes, but like, each step brings us closer to where we are going. Although I do not feel good today, my mind has power over my body, and it wants to move us instead of staying here to rest, which is what I want to do. And it just talks about this kind of like internal fight between knowing that if they stay and just rest, they're going to die, they're not going to survive, and knowing that they can't complain about it anymore because they only have themselves, and that's not going to help them. And it talks about the 2 women who had not known each other well before being abandoned. They had been 2 neighbors who thrived on each other's bad habit of complaining and on sharing conversations about things that did not matter. And now their old age and their cruel fate were all they had in common. And so they had to make it. And I don't want to totally ruin the book, but
do it. Ruin the book.
Yeah. Okay. But they make it to this camp. They make it through the summer. They just start hunting and harvesting, and they build up their shelter. They are able to do this. They sew themselves more clothes than they could possibly imagine out of rabbit pelts. And they just start stockpiling because they know it'll probably be another hard winter. And they begin to enjoy themselves, and they feel young and useful and capable. And it just is this transformation, and they no longer complain. And then they start to become very, very good friends and enjoy the visiting and the working alongside each other. Oh, Brandy, I did highlight a quote just for you, though. It says, "No, the chief had known that a drastic change in leadership would have proved more damaging than the hunger. For in times when a band is starving, bad politics leads only to further disaster."
Cannot disagree with that.
So they were talking about different things, but they had had a change of heart. The chief had decided that this was wrong, and that he sent out a group of hunters to go find the old women to see if they had survived, because they had had another hard winter and things hadn't gotten better. And they realized that this wasn't what they wanted to be. And so they came back, they found these two old women. The hunters knew that they could overtake these old women, no problem. But he felt his admiration grow stronger because the two women were ready to fight for what they had to face. They were not the same women he had known before, right? There was such a transformation. And one of the old women said, "We have to remember that they are suffering. Yes, they were too quick to condemn us, but now we have proven them wrong. If they do the same thing, we know we can survive. We have proven that much to ourselves, and we must put aside our pride long enough for us to remember that they are suffering." So they feed the search party, and, they have tons and tons to share. They say, "Yes, you can bring the tribe back. We have enough to share, but they can't come near us. We're really skeptical of you all." And then they bring the tribe, and good things happen. But the way they end it is very, very good. And I just really loved it. So relations became better between the people and the two women. Both learned from hardship. A side of people emerged that they had not known. The people had thought themselves to be strong, yet they had been weak. And the two old ones, whom they thought to be the most helpless and useless, had proven themselves to be strong. So I really love this. And I think it's a great
way to treat your old people. Oh,
no, I think it's actually really great to read to kids. I'm actually thinking of putting it into the morning time rotation because it is pretty short, but it's really well written.
Cool. Sorry, I was just thinking about the ethics of leaving old women by themselves. I feel like the story could have gone either way. I like that they survived and learned their lesson.
Well, my book doesn't quite have the happy ending. My book is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. So it was not uplifting. This is one of the books that we're reading inside Sistership in our tectonic study, so that we can use technology and set boundaries on screens and all that kind of thing in our own families in wise ways. I actually, though, got a lot more out of this book than I expected when I was assigned this book. Because if you will remember, it was the last, Brandy said, "I'm doing this," and Abby's obviously doing Balanced and Barefoot. So that leaves Misty with Irreversible Damage to lead.
Well, you turned 40, so we were like, she should practice having difficult conversations.
Oh yeah, because I hate those. Oh dear. So this book has actually been relevant in just general conversation.
Interesting.
That's always one of the things I love about doing the 5x5 challenge and reading broadly is that the book, I'm like, well, I guess I'll read that. I probably should read that. Often ends up being the one that relates to just general conversation in group settings in really fun, unexpected ways, where it's not just me talking about my pet projects and
Right.
always talking classical education or English literature or, something like that. But I thought her writing style and her approach was fascinating and well done.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
She knew her audience and she set a very specific thesis that she stuck to the whole time. So just on a journalistic, stylistic endeavor, she did a great job. This is the kind of thing that made it not as painful as it could have been. The topic's painful enough, but her treatment of it was not painful. And she even at the end basically says that the way, I would have, of course, gone stronger than what she said pretty much across the board with everything. But she does say that part of this is feminism's fault.
Yep. Part
of the transgender issue. And possibly, this is maybe the misty version of conspiracy theories, but maybe even it almost feels like a setup where what the moms were taught about feminism and about what they should encourage their daughters to do and not encourage their daughters to do set the daughters up for this transgender craze and made the moms completely ineffective in that situation.
The early feminist leaders now have well-documented I would even call it investigative reporting. It's like one of the children of one of the early feminist leaders has come out and explained some of this. And she actually, I wish I could remember her name. I really can't, but she was talking about, like the Gloria Allreds type people. And she basically says that they had meetings deliberately talking about how they would destroy the family. And a lot of it didn't involve trans that I remember in the interview that I listened to, but did involve like lesbianism and that kind of stuff. They were definitely set up to encourage perversion.
Yeah,
for sure. Deliberately.
Right. And so then it's fascinating because I also read last year, Carl Truman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where then the trans movement is kind of, eating the lesbian movement, and they're at odds, but they're kind of also united because of the alphabet soup, which actually doesn't go together.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating and disturbing, of course.
Yeah.
But one of the crazy realizations, I guess I had, because my kids are not on social media and not in public schools, and they have great friends, and we go to a solid church. This whole concept of gender being just in your head, and the idea that women and childbearing don't go together, which started with the feminist career first and family only if you want to. But we actually just have to make sure that women aren't tied to their biology through abortion, through birth control. We're going to divorce having children from being a woman. So when Abigail Schreier talks about irreversible damage, what she is saying is not just, the surgeries that you can't really undo, even the hormone therapy stuff. She's getting at all of these surgeries and hormones, all the treatments mean that these girls will be infertile.
Yeah.
And that's the irreversible damage. So I put my review on Goodreads and read some of the Goodreads reviews, which was interesting. I read the ones that were multiple paragraphs and actually, the 1-star reviews that weren't just fire-eating anger.
Right.
But it was fascinating because they acted like the author here was completely ignorant and obviously a cis woman that we shouldn't listen to, because she assumes biology has something to do with being a woman.
Wow.
When gender is actually just in your head. And she doesn't believe that. And so she's stupid and they can't believe that she was published. And they completely divorce that idea that making it so these girls will not be capable of bearing children when they're older and regret their choices. is not a big deal. Like that's not damage. They're not broken. The ability to have a baby is not a feature that we need to worry about. It was just mind-boggling. So after I finished the book, I went on about a 5-minute encouragement, but perhaps a rant to my own girls, telling them, hey, being a woman is awesome. And it's worth it. It's worth puberty. It's worth everything that, the ups and the downs, it's all part of being a woman, and we can handle it. And it's a part of our strength and growth. And anyway, I guess some of that's going to come out in today's episode, our topic. This book is probably going to come up. It will relate. But over and over, Abigail Schreier actually kept coming back to the idea that these girls don't want to become men, really. They just want to be not women.
Interesting.
Because they have no picture of the beauty of womanhood at all. Just zero. There's zero benefit to being a woman, and they don't want to be one. So that's why they just really would rather be nothing, asexual, than be a woman. And it's just heartbreaking. And so it's like, well, this makes it so easy for us. Like God's given us easy mode culture here to be a shining light. All you have to do is be a happy mom, and you are a shining light of the gospel. You are different from the rest of the world.
Can it really be that easy? I mean, I know that it's true. It's just funny because that's part of everyday life for us.
Right.
It's hard to think that like, oh, that's the thing. Like
that's all.
Just living regular life will work. Yeah. Well, should I do mine?
You're the only one left.
You better do it.
I know, but I'm sad now.
That's okay. We're going to be super cheerful with the rest of our episodes.
That's right. That's right.
We're going to be hardcore.
We're going to be tough about it. So mine actually, I cheated, Misty. I saw yours when I was signing in and I was like, oh, she's doing one from Tectonic. I should do one from Tectonic. So I chose Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which is the book that I'm leading in Tectonic. This is like my old beloved book, my old tattered book that I've had forever. I was first assigned to this book when I was going to say a junior in college, but maybe I was a senior even in college. Anyway, if I could point to, a stack of books that really impacted me in college and weren't just, books that I read because my class assigned it and I had to read it or whatever, I would put this in that stack of probably the 5 most important books that I read. In terms of how it actually affected my life. Like I read a lot of great books when I was in college, lowercase g, not to be confused with like capital G great books. But this one I actually made decisions differently because of what I had read. Heading down the road of trying to have a lower tech childhood, definitely not a no tech childhood. I mean, definitely not, but like trying to have a lower tech childhood, trying to have a no tech super early childhood. Mm-hmm. I mean, I put all of that on Neil Postman because I had to read it for class. My husband had to read it for class. And then when I was pregnant with our oldest, I actually read it aloud again in the evenings. He can't read aloud because he falls asleep. So I read aloud to him. And so we went through the book again and talked through it and, made some different decisions about our own children. But a lot of it came from this. It's just the idea that we wanted our children to first have a literary culture and to first think in a way that was uninterrupted by commercialism, right? Like one of his big things is this disruption that happens where you're learning something really serious about the world. There's a war, there's a murder, there's a suicide, whatever. And then they're like, but wait, Snickers is really awesome. And he talks about what that does to your soul to jump from something that is like a gut punch to something that is just so frivolous and commercial, and how it's training us to it basically the opposite of ordo amoris, right? It's disordering our affections, our loves, our emotions, our responses to things and that kind of stuff. And so I mean, yeah, we know our kids have to have technology to live in the world that they're in, but we just wanted to delay it and try to give them a foundation that wasn't rooted in that before, but 100% that came from Neil Postman. Like, I don't think I ever would have thought of that. I might have thought about it later, or I might have been like, not sure about computer games or something. But even that would have probably been from listening to some conservative radio where they've talked about like, well, you don't want to do cop killing games or what, you know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't have been super philosophical, but he really lays groundwork for thinking about technology, specifically screens, news, that kind of stuff differently. And I have always so appreciated him for that. So life-changing book. What can I say?
Yeah, very cool.
Hello, Abby here to tell you about Sistership, the place for moms learning and growing. We embrace the call to shape culture by starting with our own education, our own library shelves, and thinking and planning how to spend our time. We need to be equipped for the great task of educating our children. Sistership is the place to talk about reading widely, a place to discuss and think deeply, and share how you are faithfully applying the ideas you encounter. Sistership is for all the women serious about education for themselves and for their families, but understand that in order to educate, we can't take ourselves too seriously. Join us in Sistership for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
Today, you can't see me, but I'm rubbing my hands together in anticipation of Abby giving us a lecture.
Okay.
Today, we are discussing the concept of grit. And in preparation for this episode, we read an old article, which I'm sure Misty will link in the show notes. But it's from Charlotte Mason's Parents Review magazine. It's not written by Charlotte Mason. It was written by somebody who just called herself Mrs. Ward. So I don't know her first name. But the article was called Grit, or Raising and Educating Our Children. And the main gist of the article, it really, I feel like she could have written it today, really.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because she's basically like, children don't have any grit, but they should have grit. And then kind of wrapped up with, here's some basic ideas or principles for training it.
I couldn't believe when it was written.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh man, we've had this problem for that long.
Yeah.
No wonder we're sunk.
Which I was thinking, like, I suppose that there are perennial temptations in parenthood, and people usually fall off of virtue on either side, right? So there's the people who are going to be even if they're good parents, like the borderline abusive, drill sergeant, heartless, like, you know what I mean? Like that category, or worse, actual abuse or whatever.
So there's Okay.
And then,
so this is one of my points too, is I have the
I'm
four
sorry.
categories.
No, but I feel like, but then the other side is the temptation to coddle them, right? Like, oh, I just love them. They're so cute. Let's just whatever, right? I mean, so I think it's just tapping into the same things that probably parents have always struggled with, right? Like there've always been the temptation to indulge our children for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we basically agree with the premise, but I think we should start with a definition, because we don't use the word grit a whole lot other than like gritting your teeth. So how do you define grit? I gave you guys an assignment. I said, everybody has to bring definition of grit. Who wants to go first?
I feel like I better go first so that then you don't have to, because you know what? I didn't look it up in the dictionary.
Oh my goodness.
So
I didn't
quick.
either, because I was like, Misty will do it. So
I didn't look it up either.
Well, never mind then. You guys go, because we got to use the dictionary.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
That's not okay.
Okay, Brandy, you should go first then. You tell us yours.
Okay. Well, I mean, I will say my definition is mainly this way because I thought Misty was going to use the dictionary. And so I was like, I got to do something different than that. So I actually was thinking about how much of this dovetailed with the series I wrote back in 2020 when I was reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Anti-Fragile book.
Yeah.
And so I tried to take his Anti-Fragile, because this is like a business book, but or an investing book. I tried to take his principles of anti-fragility and apply them to motherhood.
Love it.
And so I was thinking about, like, if a child has grit, I think there's a sense in which he would fall into Taleb's category of anti-fragile. So there's this there's this, you're not, like the ultimate anti-fragility would be in business would be there's some sort of major black swan event. So something unforeseen, no one could have predicted it, like giant virus hits the world and they shut it down or whatever. So the person who is anti-fragile, it's not that they're unaffected by that, but they can conquer in that situation. They can even learn to flourish in that situation instead of being beaten down, victimized, So when I think of grit, I think of anti-fragility. So that was mine.
It's great. I love that definition. All right, Misty, do you have your dictionary definition?
Well, it's funny. My go-to dictionary is the American Heritage Dictionary.
Uh-huh.
And they do have informal, indomitable spirit or pluck.
Ooh, pluck.
I like pluck. But other than that, it's just about sand.
Mm-hmm.
Like pulverized rock.
Hey, rough granules, or to grit your teeth, or to cover or treat with grit. The other websites are just so much more difficult to scroll. Okay. So the Cambridge Dictionary says that it's bravery or strength of character. And then Merriam-Webster calls it firmness of mind or spirit, unyielding courage in the face of hardship or danger. And that was kind of my go-to shorthand definition. It was like just the ability to do hard things.
Yeah, it's great.
I like that.
All right. So mine, I'm just from reading for years on things and just thinking about it. My definition was taking on a deliberate challenge, exerting effort, and willingly suffering discomfort for a purpose.
I like that, willingly suffering discomfort.
Yeah.
That lends an aspect to it. I think my anti-fragility still sounds maybe a little bit more passive, like you didn't design this problem, but you're not going to let it crush you. But saying like, I'm actually going to put myself out there and be uncomfortable for the sake of something greater. I just feel like that takes it a step further.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And my second part was there is an ever-present temptation to quit, but a deeper desire and belief to keep going, growing, overcoming, and learning that is so potent, and that is grit.
So when I tried to Google a dictionary definition, I also got a definition here from James Clear. He has an article on grit. And he says that grit is perseverance and passion to achieve long-term goals. Sometimes you hear grit referred to as mental toughness. And Angela Duckworth, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, suggests that grit is a strong predictor of success.
Yes, I did read her book. And she has an excellent TED Talk about grit.
Oh, really?
Yes. So she has done lots and lots of research, and her book is pretty good, actually. I really enjoyed it.
Is it called Grit?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't even know. Look at that.
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't know, though, because then Misty would have assigned us a whole book instead of me assigning us an article. So
I've got some stuff from her book, so I've got some ideas.
Good.
I didn't.
Best of both worlds. You read it and not me.
There you go.
Sorry, I almost died by show prep this week. So
no kidding. It's been a rough week.
I have prepped this week, so I feel good about this.
Wonderful.
Topic anyway.
So in the article that we read,
yes,
Mrs. Ward, I mean, she's basically saying, like, this is the prevailing theory in her day. Like all the cool kids are doing it. All the cool kids are being very accommodating parents. Mm-hmm. And she says she thinks it's coming from the educational philosopher Froebel. And she says, it seems, whether consciously or not, to spring from Froebel's principle of securing to children the freest and most natural development by surrounding them from the first with sympathy and kindly aid, and be warding off from them rude jars and contradictions until they have grown so into harmony with the world that these no longer exist.
I didn't know what a rude jar was, though.
I think it's just like the slings and arrows of life or something.
Okay.
That's how I took it. I was thinking of like when something is jarring.
Yeah. Okay. That makes
physically
sense.
shocks you or mentally shocks you.
Sure.
Is there anything here of Froebel's that we want to keep? You know, I mean, she's kind of throwing this out, though not real excessively. I mean, she's not saying, so feed your kids on bread and water and make them sleep in the cold or anything. But I just was wondering, is there anything here that we actually agree with? This is her starting point. Is it really ours?
It sounds like Rousseau.
It does, doesn't it?
So yeah. I think that Froebel was just an educator downstream of Rousseau, trying to put Rousseau in action. So although there is a ditch on the other side, she is correct in saying this ditch is a big problem.
Yeah.
And just because you can overcorrect and fall into the opposite problem doesn't mean that this isn't a big problem.
Yeah. I think my thing was I kind of wanted to keep surrounding them with sympathy and kindly aid, but I guess it depends on what you mean by that, because that can very quickly turn into, oh, poor baby, are you okay? Like making them weaker by training their responses to be weak. But I do want it to be that my kids know they can come to me for aid, right? So I think there was that part of it just kind of stood out to me as, but maybe it's just what you're saying. I'm just trying to guard against an overcorrection because I don't want my kids to feel like, you know what, by the age of 5, I was completely on my own.
Well, and kindly aid and warding them off from like contradictions so that they grow in harmony. It sounds a lot like, you know, the helicopter parenting and the snowplow parenting that's happening now, right? Where they're just removing all obstacles.
Yes.
So that they don't have to have any contradictions or struggles or jarring thoughts or experiences. They're calling their kids college professors and complaining about their grades and how their kids need, you know, special attention and excuses. I have a friend who's a college professor and he got multiple phone calls from kids' parents in college.
That is so weird to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that although we might want to be clarifying in what it means and doesn't mean to be sympathetic, I think if you read the whole article through, you definitely see that she's not talking about being harsh.
Yeah.
She's talking about not being indulgent. A parent's job is not to make life as smooth and easy as possible for their children. That's not actually healthy for their children. So parents have care for their children by actually providing them with some hard things to do and making them do hard things. It's for their good. So you're doing it because you care. And even though a parent who tries to remove all obstacles for their children, so their children never have any distress, and like all distress is bad, would be one false parental assumption that then makes their children not prepared to actually enter the real world.
Yeah. The most disconnected from reality is that last part of the sentence. This idea that they could possibly grow into harmony with the world in such a way that there's no longer difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
What a messed up view of the world to think that you could somehow protect your children so much that they're now insulated from all of the woes of life. Just like, wow. But I guess if you think that, or if you want to believe that life could not be hard on your children, it gives you an excuse to not be hard on your children.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging that the world is a difficult place to live in is part of what makes you want to prepare them for it.
Yeah. I think it's a progressive mindset, and that she's noticing the beginnings of progressivism.
Oh, interesting.
And we now have the fruit. We're experiencing the fruit of progressivism. So I think it is the same movement. It's not just, oh, she's noticing a problem people have always had, as if, you know, saying that these temptations are still what we're seeing today. I think it really is. She's noticing these big thinkers at the beginning of progressivism, and now those progressive assumptions are pervasive and assumed and leading to the moral and social decay around us. With Rousseau and the belief that problems and trouble and war and all the bad things, all the corrupting things are outside of people.
Mm.
It's all a product of the environment. It's not a fault of the person. Like there's no fallen human nature in Rousseau. Children are blank slates, perfect, whatever. And the environment corrupts them. So if you make an environment where there's no corrupting influence, then you'll have, these happy and free, frolicking children who can then make a better environment. Like they're going to be the ones creating the environment that's going to be happy. And that's the false dream of the progressives.
Yeah. Okay. So kids should be trained to be tough. We're all there. Should moms be tough? And I don't mean should moms be tough on their children. I mean, should we ourselves have grit?
Well, I don't know of any other way that you pass on. You cannot give what you do not have. You also, your children emulate and imitate you. And so if you do not give them an example of this or give them opportunities for this, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Right. But we also don't have it just because we want our kids to have it.
Yeah.
We have it because it is a part of being a virtuous human being. It's actually a good in itself for humans to have grit.
Okay. So we want to have both. We have limited time. We're going to try to talk about both though. We're going to try to talk about tough kids and tough moms. So where do you want to start with tough kids or tough moms?
It looks like you want to start with tough moms or tough kids, because that's what the outline says.
I was trying not to be bossy, but okay, we'll start with kids.
Okay.
So what are some characteristics of tough kids? Name some things. Like when you see a kid, you're like, oh, that kid is tough. How do you know? How do you know what you're seeing?
Abby's got tough kids. You tell us, Abby. I've seen her kids.
Yes. So oftentimes what we think is it's just physical, or a lot of times it's like, oh, they're tough. They're physically, strong and capable and can keep going and work and do hard work. But it is equally true on the mental side. I think it's just, it's more easily noticeable on the physical side. So tough kids, keep going. They're unsatisfied with failure, right? They want to try again. It doesn't mean that they don't fail. There is also probably a level of expectation from people that are in their lives. Tough kids are raised in families that are demanding. Most kids probably don't have to work like my kids unless they are on a ranch or a farm because they're required to. So the level of expectation is there. But I've also seen my kids struggle with reading and being tough enough to go back and redo a phonics lesson for the 25th time because it just isn't quite there yet. Takes a level of grit that people who have an easy time learning how to read just can't quite fathom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read an article one time about how dyslexics and kids with other learning disabilities, there's like a large percentage of them that end up with very successful careers and this kind of stuff. And a disproportionate number of CEOs have one or the other. They have either dyslexia or ADHD or both. And it was interesting because the article I was reading, it was speculating that part of it had to do with the fact that everything was not easy for them as they were growing up. And so that regardless of how easy or difficult life in general was for them. Like maybe they came from wealthy parents and had everything handed to them. Like the fact that they had to struggle with something was part of what developed the qualities that would make them fit to be something like a CEO of a large company. It was just an interesting thing. But apparently that's like a trend. You can go around and
yes, I have seen it. Yeah. And, being able to have them recognize that in themselves and recognize their own maybe physical strength as well, compared to their peers or things like that. It definitely does build them up, and it keeps them going longer and harder in other areas because they know they can do it, right? There is a confidence that can be built in these tough kids, and maybe a little bit less fear of trying new things. I think that tough kids actually are willing to be a little foolish or maybe not get it. And that's something that, kids that are afraid of failing, they won't even try things.
Yeah, that's true. Kids that are naturally good at everything tend to have not developed the quality of knowing like how to handle failure or how to handle when it doesn't come naturally and when it's difficult, because they've intentionally or not managed to avoid it. And so then it's like it comes later in life, but then it's almost like they've reached this breaking point because they didn't get practice when they were children. I just remember talking with a gal one time where her husband was just like math genius. So it was like graduate school before he ever had trouble with a concept, just ever. Might have even been PhD or something. And a professor finally had to pull him aside and be like, see, this is how people feel usually like in junior high when they're learning algebra for the first time. like you've just never felt it before. So, welcome to everybody else's life. Yeah. But it was interesting to think, oh, wow, someone could go, 25 years and have never had math be hard. So, we talk a lot here about our educational goal being to encourage the child's growth and virtue. We want to see virtue developing. So how does developing grit relate to developing virtue? Is it the same path, a parallel path, like one supports the other? How do you think these two relate?
I think in a way, grit is the same as courage, or it's a form of courage. And so, that is one of the virtues. But I love the C.S. Lewis quote on courage, which is that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. So I think without grit, without courage, without toughness, and a willingness to do what's hard, you can't have any of the virtues, because none of the virtues really attained is easily come by.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you're a mom or before you're a mom and you're like, oh yeah, I'm patient. I don't usually lose my temper or anything. I'm not easily irritated. Well, then you have kids and then you find out, oh, I actually am impatient. I just wasn't tested. My patience wasn't tested yet.
Yeah. It's easy to think you're patient when you live in an apartment where everything's exactly the way you want it.
In the article, on the last paragraph, I guess, it says, no endeavor to strengthen a child's will and to create self-reliance, energy, and endurance will succeed if his life be dull and dreary. If half his time he is what we elders called, in our own case, being bored. He must have things in which it is worth his while to gain if he is to make struggles. He must have interests if he is to be eager. He must have plenty of scope for his faculties and activities if he is to exert them. And this scope would always be a little ahead of them. I think that encouraging a child's growth in virtue, right? We actually have to set them up so that they are able to do that. And that takes an active role and thought in how we are going to develop these things in our homes or in the activities that we choose for our kids, because it just doesn't happen by accident, right? And I think that, it's taking deliberate challenges and exerting effort and then willingly suffering discomfort for these things.
Yeah.
Even though I wrote the question, I didn't actually spend a ton of time thinking about the connection between virtue and developing grit. But the question was actually provoked by something I ran across today, which was just a discussion online between some moms about children who had been given a lot by their father, who had been, raised in a very difficult situation. And so it was like, he wants to give them everything that he didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
But the mom's really struggling because the children are like super entitled and demanding. We talk about like, how do you know when you see a strong child, a child that has grit? Well, how do I know when I see a weak child? And I was thinking one thing is total ingratitude and being demanding. That is not virtue. It's the absence of virtue. There's things missing there. I mean, we're all ungrateful sometimes. We are all demanding sometimes. I don't deny it. But a person who has a pattern of that, where their whole life is characterized by very high expectations for others and very low expectations for themselves, that is the opposite of developing virtue. And if we are developing kids along those lines, purposely or not on purpose, usually it's accidental, we're ending up with a child that does not have virtue. It's just kind of like a suck on the world around him. And so I don't know exactly where virtue stops and grit ends and where they like how they relate and how they separate or whatever. But I think I do know that coddling does not develop virtue, and it also develops weakness.
Yes. In that example where, it's possible, and I have no idea, but it's possible to take a Rousseau approach in that and say it's the environment, it's the stuff that they have that's making them entitled. Or is it our actual parenting? And I think it's less about the stuff and more about like the examples in this article that she gives. So here, it's a short paragraph. She's later on, when a child has some command of language and can reason, there are a few necessary everyday disagreeables which he should be expected manfully to face, such as going to bed or picking up toys or taking a coldish bath. A little assistance or encouragement in doing such things might be given, but wheedling and cajoling must be avoided. I have seen people make a habit of chasing a child upstairs and frolicking with him every night so that he is deluded as to the real end in view. And the consequence was when he reached the top and the chill reality burst suddenly upon him, he always howled fearfully. Like, we should be calling our children to do what they need to do and not tricking them into do what we want them to do, or trying to convince small children to obey us.
Like hiding vegetables in the brownies.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, Brandy, you said like entitled or ungrateful and things like that. Like this is that. But I was thinking that, you said one other thing, but I was thinking that the unwillingness to be disciplined or coached or trained, like I've seen that in weak children too, right? That goes back to like your whole theory on strong-willed, which is not strong-willed, right? They are unwilling to recognize that anyone else might have something to say. And that's definitely a parenting thing.
Well, why don't we go ahead and hop into the basic ways of training kids to be tough? She's got great examples in the article.
I think a big one is that it actually, a part of the problem really is that it takes grit on the mother's part to impart grit because, we hide the vegetables in the brownie. I'd never have done that. But, we do those things where we try to trick our kids into doing what we want to have happen because we don't want to face having to deal with the issue. We don't want to have to basically parent and counsel our children through having the right response because it is exhausting and it is a lot of work. But the thing is, the payoff of actually disciplining and discipling your children is way worth it. Let me just say, it's way worth it.
I have a few things I pulled from Anti-Fragile.
Okay.
I had written a couple articles and I just went through and I thought, I'm just going to pull the points here because I felt like even though he's talking about how to build an anti-fragile business, I was like, oh, you could totally use these principles to build an anti-fragile child. One thing he talked about was not making sure they're always comfortable.
Yeah.
He basically says, like the equivalent for motherhood that he would say about business is basically like, if you want your kids to be wimps, then you should just always make sure they're comfortable. Never let them face a moment of pain or deprivation. Don't let them go hungry ever. Don't let them go thirsty. Don't let, no heat, no chill, no inconvenience. We're so quick to dispense an antipyretic if a child has a small temperature because we don't want them to be uncomfortable, or a Tylenol because they have a headache. And I'm not saying like, gosh, we should just let, your kid has a broken arm and you shouldn't give them any pain pills, whatever, or whatever. Like, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying, people 100 years ago didn't have those kinds of tools. You couldn't just medicate your child every time they were facing a physical pain. And we didn't have water bottles. So it turned out you had to be thirsty until next time you were in the kitchen or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Or in a car ride.
Right? It's interesting how the assumption is that the child should never go thirsty, never be hungry. The small pains are part of what help us learn to deal with larger pains.
Mm-hmm.
Certain things in my life, people have actually said, how did you handle this particular pain? And it's like, well, turns out when you have Lyme disease growing up and you're in pain forever, I didn't want to have that, but it does make you handle pain a little differently. Like your first thought isn't to medicate it or to think that your whole world is ending because you have a headache or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to see if children became more resilient just because they didn't get to have a snack right before dinner, but they had to actually wait while hungry,
Yeah. Or even things like not interrupting. All the opportunities that we have to teach our children to control their impulses, teach them grit and endurance. And they might seem little and insignificant, but they add up.
Yeah. I had another one that was about allowing our kids to experience loss.
Yeah.
So in the context of the Anti-Fragile book, he talks about taking financial risks and being willing to have, small losses in order to learn how to lose and learn how to win, really. And as I was thinking about what he was saying about business, I kept coming back to the idea that kind of like how small pains prepare us to handle big pain, small losses prepare us for big losses. So pets die. Right? Like, especially we get rabbits. So rabbits, they're just so fragile. And we've had a lot of death at our house, but I'm thinking we've even had pets kill other pets. It was interesting to watch my children suffer those small losses of pets for one reason or another, pet dying in the heat or whatever. And then how they handled death later on, like death of real humans in their lives that they loved. And thinking, I don't know, I can't experience an alternative universe, but I do wonder if all of those small losses made death more familiar, grief more familiar, and that's why they handled it well. I don't know. I just know that for me, like when my grandfather died, that was like the first time ever known anything that died. And I felt like it was extremely difficult, but I also didn't have any practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or things like buyer's regret or carrying your pocket change in your pocket and playing with it and losing it. Like all those kinds of different life experiences that you can have on a small scale and let your children have those experiences and natural consequences on a small scale.
Yeah.
Is so helpful for them to then build on in a mature way later.
I have one more from the Grit article, and then I know Abby's just chomping at the bit for this. So I really appreciated where she talked about just basically having the child contribute.
Yeah.
Right. Like if he can do it for himself, then he should. I was just thinking about how the demanding, ungrateful child, she talked about how that actually gives him some sympathy with grown-up people. And so he becomes a little more understanding because he too has earned his way in some small way. But she talks about how this is the very last paragraph, and it's actually before what you read, I think.
Yes.
But she says, from the first, a child's own efforts, physical, mental, and moral, should be as intimately as possible associated with all that he gains of good and avoids of evil. And what was interesting was that that was one of the big things that I concluded from reading Anti-Fragile. When it comes to children, we should make sure that in their life causes have effects. Because I think that lots of times that's what mothers are doing. We're interrupting the connection between cause and effect in some way. We want to shield them so they're not making that natural connection between cause and effect, which means they feel like they have no power over, what does she say? The gains of good and the avoids of evil. Like they don't have power over either. So we're creating this person who feels very powerless and weak.
Yes. So Angela Duckworth's book does talk quite a bit about that hopelessness. And it's a feeling of lack of control. If your kids never feel like they have any sort of control over their own circumstances, like whether it's a tough situation or not, whereas either people are preventing them from it or they've rescued them from it, if they have no sense of control, they often get that learned helplessness. And one of the things that is really, really helpful to kids is if they do have a sense of, actually, I get to make a choice in this situation, regardless of the consequences. But even just having that gives them the hope, and that often leads to perseverance, grit, and trying again, even if they do fail, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Not having any sort of feeling of control is such a hopeless thing. Learning that we do have self-control is such an important part of teaching our kids and raising them and discipling them, right? That they have the self-control to actually get yourself under control of your emotions. I know you're hurt, but let's calm it down and let's try to get, stand up and brush ourselves off, right? Or
blow it out, be tough.
Yeah, be tough. Your friends, my kids are getting more friends, and some people say rude things behind your back and all these things. And it's like, okay, so how do you deal with that? That's a toughness that we haven't had to deal with because that's never happened before. So how do we treat this person? Having that you have the control to not continue talking badly, and you can either choose to forgive them or, choose not to be friends with them. Those are your choices. And I think those everyday little things do prepare us. But if kids never have to overcome any obstacles, they will not be prepared for life.
Yeah. We've taught, we, meaning me, because done this mainly when my husband's not been around, but my girls specifically, because I think girls are a little more prone to cry in general as like a stereotype, cry later. So it wasn't, you can't ever have an emotional release over this, but we're not going to do this
in public.
We're in public where we're causing drama or someone else to be uncomfortable. And I remember distinctly telling kids where they're going to have a difficult thing at the dentist or whatever, where I knew there was a lot of nervousness, which means there's more temptation for them to cry. I basically said, I know you're tempted to fall apart. We will do it in the car, or we will do it when we get home. I don't want to teach them to completely stuff their emotions, but there is context for when things are appropriate and when they're not. And I feel like that teaches self-control.
Right. Because you're not using your emotions then to manipulate the situation.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It teaches them self-control in a very manageable way when you're little, because it gives you a goal. You're not waiting indefinitely. Mom didn't say you're not allowed to cry. She said you cannot do it here and now. So I feel like when you're little, it's kind of like when math's only going to be 20 minutes, so you can make it through the whole thing, right? If math is 3 hours, it's a little bit too long for you when you're tiny, right? So I feel like it's the same kind of thing. It's a manageable goal to say, wait until we get here. We used to say the same thing with gossip, actually, like learning to control your tongue. And I don't want to say like, yes, you can gossip in my car, but it was like, let's say you went to a dance recital and you have something critical to say. 1 mile rule. We need to be in the car a mile away from the event before you say something so that you don't accidentally embarrass yourself and hurt someone's feelings. Right. So same kind of thing though, like learning to hold off, right? That's that self-control, but on a time limit.
That's good.
Yeah. And it comes in handy when you do have things like, my daughter, she ripped her foot wide open.
Oh,
we had to go to urgent care. She was very upset, in a lot of pain, had to have a ton of stitches. it was near closing time and the doctor was not happy about having to be there. And he's like, if she can't get in control, she's going to have to go to the ER. And so we had a conversation. I said, I really like to not go to the ER because you go from a $40 copay to $500.
Oh,
like
my
that.
word. Yeah.
And I said to my daughter, you can handle this. I know you are tough and I know this hurts, but we need to get these stitches and then we can go home. And,
Yep.
It was not, the entire bottom of her foot. It was a lot of stitches.
Oh my gosh.
It was totally understandable why she was upset and totally acceptable that she was crying. But because she was, shaking and upset, and she got herself in control enough to be able to get stitches. And that's something that she'll always have. And that's the thing about grit too, is there is compounding interest. When our kids get a little bit of that grit in them, then it gives them kind of that fortitude that lasts with them for a very long time. And then we can bring it up with them. Like, remember when you had to have stitches when you ripped your foot open? You can handle this, right? And we remind them of their fortitude. We remind them of, the virtue that they've already done some suffering and hard work, and they can do it again, and it's not going to be so bad.
There are just so many times in life when not panicking is the key to surviving the moment that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
I had an emergency C-section one time, and I had a baby that was losing heartbeat with every little contraction. And the way of getting through it was that I had to force myself to calm down because the worse that my breathing got, the worse his oxygen got, the worse his heart rate got. They can only do emergency surgery so quickly. So you've got this like almost 1 hour where they're trying to prep you as fast as they can. And learning when you're little that there's a time and a place for panic and now is not it she may save her own life or someone else's someday because she learned that skill, really.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So can we transition to tough moms? Because we're going to run out of time.
Yep.
So what are characteristics of tough moms? What are you looking for? Like, how would you say that mom is tough?
Well, we talked about, being a parent that's tough, like that, has expectation and demands children to be, well-behaved and do their work thoroughly and those kinds of things. Like that does take a toughness and not letting your kids run roughshod over you. But I want to say too, though, that being tough does not mean unfeminine.
Amen.
Right. I was thinking about this because sometimes we think, oh, tough, I'm just not tough. I'm frail. I'm not very strong. I'm not athletic. Like we think of all these things and we have all these preconceived notions about toughness, and it doesn't actually have to do with a lot of that. You think of Proverbs 31, right? She is strong. She is capable. She's got her stuff together, right? I love the verse where she talks about she is clothed with strength and dignity. Yeah. And I think that is what grit in a mom has, dignity. She's not run by her emotions. She doesn't fall apart when things are tough.
Super hard worker. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. She holds her head up high and she laughs at the days to come. It is almost impossible to have grit without an optimistic view. Because if you do not have optimism, you will not persevere.
So true.
And this doesn't mean that we are like, oh, everything will work out, sunshine and rainbows. This is not the optimism, but it is like based in reality. She laughs at the days to come, right? As Christians, we know that God holds everything together. We know that there is a purpose and there is a calling for each of us. And we know that we are promised suffering. This is something that actually is going to happen. I came across a new book at the library by Twyla Tharp, and she wrote The Creative Habit, which is an excellent book, but she wrote a new one. And, she's 75 and still working out every day and still doing her like lifelong work of being a choreographer in New York. And she has this great quote, and it says, many carry the misconception that we should become more comfortable and things should become easier as time goes by. This is a belief system designed to undermine you. In life, there will be problems. This is guaranteed. We must learn to use our obstacles, transforming them into advantages.
What are some ways that we as mothers, homeschooling our children, raising kids, what are some ways that we can be tough? And what are some ways that we can become tougher if we feel like we're not? Like, what if I'm listening to this and I'm like, I'm such a baby and my parents coddled me my whole life? How is it displayed in daily life now? And how can we work on it in the context of daily life if we feel like we're lacking?
Habit training yourself and disciplining yourself, right? What is a discipline that, or a habit that you've always wanted to cultivate? And then you choose that and then you do it. I mean,
Wait,
this is
what?
We give up so easily.
And we are so obsessed with comfort, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting up early to read our Bible and pray is like, well, I'm just really tired and I need more sleep. So I'm just going to sleep through that again. I don't want to exercise.
Mm-hmm. I think our optimism, even if we have it, it's set too short term so that we want the payoff like immediately, instant gratification. Almost anything good, it's actually delayed gratification. And so it's like, well, I tried that habit like 3 times and I don't know, it just made my day harder.
3 times.
So that's not working for me. That's just not something, I can do. That's the opposite of grit. And that's not it's a false optimism.
Yeah. What is it? We underestimate or we overestimate what we can do in a day and underestimate what we can do in 10 years, right? Isn't that something like that? Yeah. Of course, it's not going to feel great the first 35, 45 times you do it. And I think that a lot of times is like the common wisdom is like, well, it takes 21 days to make a habit, but that's not actually true. That's just something that one study said, and it actually takes a lot longer to, form those affections, right?
And then you still have to do it.
Yeah. And then you still have to keep doing it. Yeah. I mean, if you haven't read James Clear, Atomic Habits, I think that's a great one that talks about, these tiny habits that you can build over time. And it's 1%, like it's aggregated marginal gains, like being 1% better. Like, I think that those are really helpful. But, we need people and things that we're reading, and people are inspiring, right? You need to read about interesting lives of heroes and people who have suffered, right? Missionary biographies are great, which is why we need to read those to our kids and read them ourselves, because we are far too easily pleased and we are far too obsessed with comfort. And that makes people fragile, right? And if we're going with Brandy's definition, like that anti-fragile, like becoming stronger through adversity, not getting totally decimated when things come up, preparing. Yeah.
I was trying to think of what are some real ways to develop ourselves in this area. One thing that came to mind for me was just this idea that it is comfort in many ways that is the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also thinking in connection about how like comfort's not super satisfying. Mm-mm. Like it's way more satisfying at the end of the day than it is at the beginning of the day. Like if you start your day off with being comfortable, it's not as rewarding as you've worked really hard.
Yeah.
And now you settle down with a good book or something and, whatever. So I don't know. I was trying to put those things together and I was thinking, I wonder if some of the key is just embracing being uncomfortable. Kind of like how I had to embrace the idea that, the fact that this day was hard or the situation with my children was hard doesn't mean I'm doing it wrong, because turns out doing the right thing is hard.
Yes.
But I was wondering if it like that extrapolates to just a general, like, I'm going to embrace being uncomfortable.
Yep.
I'm outside. I live in the desert in California. It's 107 and I'm not going to be a big baby about it.
Yep.
I'm going to save that for when it's cold.
I was going to say, or when you're in northern Idaho and it's 19 degrees.
Right. Yeah.
I'm still going to get my steps.
That's right.
Here, a great way to develop being uncomfortable is to embrace the fact that it's hot a lot of the time. And where you are, the opposite is true. Embrace the fact that it's cold. Learn to deal with it. I'm thinking about skills that transfer, those kinds of things, learning to be uncomfortable, transfer.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was thinking too about if we're aside from physical things, right? I know so many people that are like, that book, I just didn't understand anything. So I just gave it up. Right. Yeah. Reading, what is it? Mystique says old, hard, and bad books.
Wrong. Not bad.
Not bad. Wrong books. That's it. Wrong.
There's a difference.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Sorry. Wrong books. The things that really challenge you intellectually. I mean, yes, of course, it's easier to read a novel or something that we love and have read before. But what if you actually persevere and read that gigantic tome that you bought with all the good intentions, but then gave up, right? That's part of it too.
Interesting. So it's the same thing. It's just on a different, like, so you're willing to be uncomfortable,
Yes.
but in your mind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And wrestle with those ideas and have to reread. So that's the other thing about grit is like, you have to have opportunities to do it over and over and over again, right? Like it's not a one and done thing. And it's just like a really tough passage in a book. Like, I do not understand this. Okay. And the other thing that I think that is really, really important is that sometimes we actually need help. We can ask people like, hey, I need an accountability partner to make sure that I am getting up and reading my Bible and praying. Would you do that with me? I will text you when I'm up and doing it, right? If you are trying to do an athletic thing, right? Hiring yourself a personal trainer that you are paying for will make you show up and you will work way harder. And it is actually going to make you get closer to your goals if that's what you're doing. If you are reading really hard books that you don't quite understand, Sistership has tons of people who you can ask questions to, and they will totally answer things, or they will point you in a direction of like a commentary or something that helped them, right? There are so many ways that we can leverage our discomfort with actually just maybe we don't need that to totally give up and quit, but what we need is just a little bit more support, right? And so finding support and keeping our expectations of ourselves high, that's where it's really important. And I think that's true with kids, right? We are demanding them to rise above and be better and we have high expectations, right? But we're also giving them the support. We're not just throwing them into the deep end of the pool and letting them flounder. We are giving them tools and we are helping them. We're encouraging them. But that's one of the things about grit is there is always hope and you just don't give up. You don't quit. You just find a new way to get the help that you need.
It's helpful to take the long view because I think we get mired in our own failures because we're comparing ourselves to the standard and saying, well, look at how far away I am from it. And some, I think, are discouraged by that to the point of not even wanting to try. But I had this friend today who she's had a lot of health problems. And she was talking about how, and she still has a lot. But she was talking about how different things are compared to last year. She's been working on everything for a year and how much better, how far she has come. And I was thinking, I think that is also a helpful thing. That instead of just realizing, oh goodness, I'm still a big baby in all these areas and I still have trouble persevering, and we're trying to track our progress in such a way that we realize we can do this.
We are making progress.
Yes. Yeah. That can be helpful, especially for those who are easily discouraged. Some of us kind of have that personality. And I think it's good to know that about ourselves and try to figure out like, how can I show myself the truth in both regards? Because people like me who are a little more Pollyanna might need to be shown the truth in the other way. Like you said you were going to do this and didn't. But I'm just thinking like, I don't know. I think ways of, like habit trackers or whatever, ways of tracking, even if it's just a little 1 sentence a day journal or something, or a picture of your progress or whatever, but just a way of saying, oh, look at how far we have come. We did do this and it did make a difference.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, I actually think a good follow-up to this is going to be the Masterly Inactivity episode we have coming up. So
yeah.
So we'll get more of these ideas, I think, coming.
Okay. I have one quote I can end
on.
It.
Yeah.
Okay. The pathway of least resistance leads to the least life. It's the narrow pathway of great resistance that leads to the great life. And that is from a new book by Ann Voskamp.
Thanks for coming, you guys. This was a fun conversation.
Yes. Thanks, Brandy.
Yes.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/SS118 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for the Scholé Sistership and join the 5x5 Reading Challenge support group. The 5x5 Reading Challenge really helps you read widely, which is the first step in self-education. Just go to scholésisters.com/join and become a Sophie member. In the next episode, Abby and I are having a fabulous chat with Jason Barney from Educational Renaissance. Jason has lots of great thoughts on motivating by rewards and why that's so dangerous. You're going to love what he has to say. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
All right, I put my podcast recording in session on the door. I even showed one of my kids. I was like, I put a note on the door. He's like, well, let me see it. And I said, all right, come up, see it. It's hot pink. You cannot miss it. So I'm hoping. Yeah. Do not interrupt. We will see if it works.
All right. Are we ready?
Yes.
Transition? I feel like I can't use the word transition anymore.
I know. I've thought about that too. But you know what? They don't own it. I think about it every time you say it, but I'm like, no, we can actually just hold.
That's right.
Real definition on that.
Keep the language.
Yeah, we're not going to.
That's right.
We're not going to bend.
Have babies. Read a book. Possibly cook something at some point.
I do that. Yeah.